793 in Lindisfarne Monastery here is a little bit on fire. It was set on fire by a group of raiders commonly known as Vikings who saw the wealthy, poorly defended monastery as easy pickings, which to be fair, it was. The raid on Lindisfarne is often considered to be the beginning of the period of European history known as the Viking Age, because hereafter the number of seaborne raids and the amount of Viking activity across Europe increased dramatically. So who were these Vikings? Well, they originated from Scandinavia, what is now Denmark, Norway and Sweden. Be aware that these weren't a single group of people, they had different social and religious practices and were more than happy to raid each other when it was profitable. Speaking of raiding, Viking has become synonymous with raider, but it's important to note that many Vikings were simply seaborne traders and most stayed at home farming. Farming in Scandinavia was a mixed bag, and in the north of the Viking territories it was practically impossible because cold. Southern Denmark and parts of Norway and Sweden were actually quite good for farming, but population growth meant that other means such as fishing was needed for sustenance. The difficult climate and terrain of Scandinavia also made governing the people there very difficult. Kings often ruled with a light touch, since commanding someone who was on an island, over a mountain or on the other side of a dense forest wasn't that easy. That said, force was one of the primary ways of securing loyalty, along with rewarding followers with gifts. There were some areas in Scandinavia which were pretty good in terms of resources, and it was around these areas that power coalesced. The history of Scandinavia during the 9th century is shrouded in myth and legend, and frankly there is very little that can be said as definite fact. Just a quick note on names too. We'll be using the names Danish, Swedish and Norse-Norwegian, but be aware that the borders in Scandinavia weren't settled and that people simply lived wherever was habitable. Anyway, in the 9th century, Norway, named after the sea route along its coast, the Northern Way, was a land of many petty kingdoms who rose and fell as they vied for dominance. That is, until a certain king, Harald Fairhair, shows up around 872, but again, no one knows for sure. It was he who established a power base over the course of a few decades, gained overlordship over the north, and then defeated a confederation of petty kings at the Battle of Hafrsfjord. And it was after his victory that Harald declared himself to be the first king of the Norwegians. In what is now Denmark, the 9th century isn't much clearer, and actually the name Denmark wasn't used until about the year 930. It is known though from the records of the Frankish Empire of Charlemagne that some of the lords who lived there wielded a great deal of power and that the Danes were noted fighters. In Sweden, named after the Sverre people who lived here, there is loads of evidence about what happened down to the tiniest minutiae. Oh wait, no there isn't. What can be said for sure though is that the people that lived there lived mostly in these areas, and that the Sverre made a great deal of contact with their neighbours across the Baltic Sea. Also, shockingly, it was divided into petty kingdoms. It's also known that the Swedes made regular contact with the Sami people from the north, and it's likely that some of their religious practices were adopted from them. So whilst not a great deal is known about Scandinavia itself during this period, the people from there certainly made an impact in other places. The 9th century saw widespread raiding across Western Europe, such as those on Francia between 840 and 850. The Franks fortified their coasts and rivers, which forced the Vikings to turn their attention elsewhere. To the British Isles. The British Isles had been subject to Viking raids throughout most of the 9th century, and its wealth attracted many, mostly from Denmark, to come and take it. The 860s saw the landing of the Great Heathen Army in Britain, which devastated many of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms there and made a lot of money doing so. The Norse, those from Norway, raided their way across the northern and western coasts of Scotland and ended up at the island of Ireland, where they did yet more raiding. The reasons behind Viking raiding are fiercely debated and range from a lack of arable land back home to cope with population growth to honour-based or semi-religious reasons, more on that in a bit. The Great Heathen Army soon changed from one of raiding to one of conquest, and in short time they conquered and settled this area, subsequently called the Danelaw. The Norse conquered most of the northern islands across the British Isles and also settled places like Dublin and Cork, which soon became important slave trading hubs. To the north lay the uninhabited island of Iceland. Iceland was settled by a man called Ingolfur Einarsson, who settled Reykjavik in 874, and unlike the rest of Europe, no one lived there, and so settlement was done without violence. The Norse also settled the Faroe Islands here, but no one knows when for sure. Expansion wasn't limited to the west or to the north. The east also saw a great deal of Viking, mostly Swedish activity. The Vikings moved south, settling, raiding and trading until they came to the Black Sea and made contact with a very wealthy Byzantine Empire. There's a lot of questions concerning the manner of Scandinavian settlement in Eastern Europe and to what extent they dominated the region. However, they were definitely deeply involved in the politics of the area, and it made the Vikings there very wealthy. The Vikings brought great change with them to the places they settled. Generally speaking, the Vikings were much more urbanised, and they expanded major settlements like York, Dublin and Kiev, which became deeply intertwined with European trade. The social changes they brought with them varied depending on the region, but the primary area of conflict between the Vikings and those they conquered was that of religion. So the Viking religion was a form of Germanic paganism and is extremely complicated. There were many gods, and not all Vikings worshipped the same gods. There were also the Norns, who determined a person's unchangeable destiny, and this idea of a set fate was extremely important. For example, if you were destined to die in combat, you would ideally go forth looking for combat to approach your fate bravely. Christians had attempted to convert people in Scandinavia for centuries by this point, ultimately to no avail. In fact, many Vikings recognised the Christian desire to convert them and went along with it for political gain. One such example was Rollo, who, in 911, after raiding Francia, was given this land in Normandy, which was probably the land he was occupying. He was officially given it on two conditions: prevent raiding from other Vikings and, of course, be baptised. For many Vikings, baptism was a sincere act of conversion, and for others it was just a thing Christians wanted you to do after they paid you off. In fact, some Vikings complained that the baptism they were just given wasn't as nice as their last one. So back in Norway, things were starting to heat up. Harald Fairhair died around 930, his kingdom fell apart, and what remained went to his son Eric I, better known as Eric Bloodaxe. He was kicked out in 933 by his brother, the new king Haakon, also known as Haakon the Good, and Eric went off to rule Dublin and Northumbria. Haakon was, as his name suggests, a pretty good king and sought to strengthen his realm. He was also a Christian and attempted to convert his subjects, but once he realised they were pretty annoyed with the whole Jesus thing, he himself went back to worshipping the Norse gods. By the mid-10th century, Denmark was still divided into many kingdoms, and it was this one, the kingdom of Jutland, which was ruled by a man called Gorm the Old. Gorm, being old, died in 958 and was succeeded by his son, Harald, better known as Harald Bluetooth. Harald would go on to conquer the entirety of the now Gormless Denmark, which is one of the reasons he's so famous. The other is that he converted to Christianity. This was after he attempted to raid the Holy Roman Empire under Otto I in 960. Harold lost and thus was made to convert, but be aware that there were already many Christians in Denmark, such as those who had returned from the Danelaw. So one thing you'll have noticed throughout this episode is that I keep saying how we don't know much for certain. So how do we know anything about the period? The primary sources are often from outside of Scandinavia, like those from England or Francia, but there are two important Scandinavian sources. The first were the Jelling stones, which were inscribed stones which were made at Jelling, the old capital of Jutland. The major ones were made by Harald Bluetooth to celebrate both the unification of Denmark and its conversion to Christianity. The other source is the sagas, mostly from Iceland, which were narrative stories written hundreds of years after the events they spoke of. Hence why half of what is written in the sagas is seen as semi-legendary, not strictly trustworthy. So back to Denmark, the rest of Harald's reign did see him depose King Haakon the Good and replace him with his nephew, Harald Greycloak. Greycloak did basically nothing except die in 970, and so Harald declared himself to be the king of Norway too. This would mark the high point of Harald's reign, since in 986 he was deposed by his son, Sweyn Forkbeard. Sweyn Forkbeard's reign is frankly a bit of a mystery. After taking the throne, he appears to have either raided England and Scotland for about a decade or was exiled there by his nobles and the Swedish king Eric the Victorious. In 995 he appears to have lost Norway to Olaf Tryggvason, who undertook converting it to Christianity with some success. Slightly after this, the Swedish king Olaf Skirtkonung would do the same thing in his realm. Again, the problem with Swedish history at this point is that nobody can say for sure what was going on. It's pretty certain that the Sverre had conquered the Geats to the south, but their northern borders are basically unknown. Up in Iceland, a man called Eric the Red was banished for manslaughter in the late 10th century. Shortly afterwards, he stumbled across and then settled Greenland. Eric's son, Leif Ericson, would then in the year 1001 discover North America. So take that, Columbus. There were some temporary settlements in North America, but for some reason they didn't last, and thus North America wouldn't see European contact again for nearly half a millennium. Sweyn would at some point return to Denmark, and after the death of Tryggvason in the year 1000 he reclaimed Norway. He went back and forth raiding England for many years, and in 1013 he managed to seize it for himself and become king there, thus beginning England's royal house of Denmark. He died the next year, and his son Canute would begin his rule in England 2 years later. By 1028 Canute ruled all of these lands, now known as the North Sea Empire. Canute died in 1035 and his kingdoms were divided and fighting broke out. The kingship of Canute would be used by his descendant, the King of Norway Harald Hardrada, who in 1066 landed in Northumbria with the intent to take England's crown for himself. This went pretty well for his enemies, since Hardrada got himself killed. 1066 and the death of Harald Hardrada is considered by many to mark the end of the Viking Age. The reason for this is largely because the Viking nations were a part of the Christian world and were no longer able to raid with impunity or even defeat their enemies. Denmark, Sweden and Norway were Christian kingdoms just like any other, and so there were rules. You couldn't simply take a kingdom now just because you wanted it. You couldn't turn up and raid, murder or enslave your fellow Christians anymore. That's not to say that nobody from these places ever raided again. They did, and the Norwegian holdings in the British Isles would remain theirs until the 15th century. The legacy of the Viking Age is extremely far-reaching. This period did not settle the issue of Scandinavian borders, but it taught the rest of Europe that Scandinavia was not something it could ignore anymore. Obviously, one legacy is that it spread the Scandinavian culture to the Faroe Islands, Iceland and Greenland. They changed language and the politics of much of Western Europe, and whilst Hardrada had failed to subdue England, it was William, the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, who would conquer it immediately afterwards. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching, and a special thanks to Thomas Gestrich, Adam Harvey, Winston Kaywood and James Bisonet. If you'd like to learn more about the Viking Age, there are some book recommendations in the description below.